Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here. I'm Julie Simek. I'm a paintings conservator specializing in European Old Master paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the museum. I also want to thank our guests from the delegation of Flanders to the US, which is part of the Consulate of Belgium, for being here this afternoon. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's program. Jacquelyn N. Coutré is the Eleanor Wood Prince Curator in Painting and Sculpture of Europe at the Art Institute of Chicago. Since her arrival in 2019, she has overseen the 2021 reinstallation of the 17th century Dutch and Flemish galleries, acquired paintings by Edvard Collier and Maria van Oosterwijk, and curated Van Gogh in the avant-garde, the modern landscape in 2023. She specializes in early modern Northern European art with an emphasis on Rembrandt's circle, artistic competition and exchange, and collecting histories. Now, please welcome me in joining, please join me in welcoming Jacquelyn Coutré to the stage.
In February of 2024, we installed a 3-year loan in our galleries devoted to the painting and sculpture of Europe. It comes to us from the Phoebus Foundation in Antwerp, one of the world's largest collections of Southern Netherlandish painting and sculpture from the Renaissance and early modern eras. We had already had a relationship with the Phoebus Foundation, but this long-term loan really solidified this transatlantic partnership, and I would like to thank the Phoebus Foundation team for their collegiality and generosity in making this loan possible. The object is, of course, that which you see on the screen, a 15th century house altar executed in Brussels, which is comprised of a carved corpus and painted hinged wings. The installation, as Julie can well attest, was complex to say the least. For example, the spear of what is likely Longinus on the right is separate and had to be delicately inserted into his tiny wooden hand. The painted wings had to be opened and hinged very delicately to the wall with bespoke mounts. And then the carved, glittering corpus had to be dusted so that the polychromy and gilding would really make those figures sparkle. This was, I would think, perhaps a 7-hour affair for the team, and I'm very grateful for the art handlers, for Julie, our registration team, for their commitment in ensuring that this object was safely installed in our galleries. But of course, this was not the debut of this altar in the US. That happened in December of 1921 when it was first unveiled at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art, in an exhibition of carved sculpture imported from Europe. A local newspaper article celebrated the show as foregrounding, quote, masterpieces of the sculptor's art, such pieces as are seldom seen outside the great museums of the world. This is not hyperbole by any means. For such fully intact altars are not only quite rare, but they are incredibly fragile. Many of the ones that exist throughout the world today have 19th century replacement figures, or the painted wings have been removed from the carved corpus. This example, in contrast, has experienced some minor interventions. There is some replacement polychromy and gilding in the carved corpus. There are minor retouchings on the painted wings, but overall it remains a relatively well-preserved example of a late 15th century altar. In other words, over 100 years later, we can still say that it is a masterpiece of the sculptor's art. Today, I will talk a bit about the altar's origins and the landscape of artistic production of such small-scale altars in the region of Brabant in modern-day Belgium, its unusual iconography, and what that can tell us about the function of this altar beyond its original site of installation, and its provenance, that is, its history of ownership, and how it is engaging with our early Netherlandish collection here at the Art Institute. Southern Netherlandish altarpieces from the early modern era have a few distinctive features, one of them being the carved corpus, which is typically made of Baltic wood that had been imported into the Brabant region and then painted by local painters. The wings that were hinged to that corpus were also distinctive. In other countries, these wings were typically carved rather than painted. And sometimes even those carvings were not painted to reflect the lifelike reality of those figures. These objects served as devotional aids and liturgical devices that really energized all the senses. And so I show you this detail here of a painting by the great 15th century painter Rogier van der Weyden. And you can imagine in a small chapel, the altarpiece being illuminated by candlelight that flickers and really makes that polychromy and gilding sparkle. It would also be activated by the sounds of chanting or singing, perhaps even accompanied by music, and at certain times of the year, incense. So the experience of these altarpieces would have been very much a multi-sensory one. Now, I have referred to this as a house altar, and in fact, the nomenclature can be a bit confusing. They are typically called house altars, but that does not necessarily refer to how they would have originally been used. That refers more to their small scale dimension. The example that we have here from the Phoebus Foundation measures about 3.5 feet by about 5 feet wide, perhaps appropriate for a domestic context, hence the name house altar. But the scholar Nicholas Gleesman has argued that, yes, they could have been used in a house, but also perhaps in a convent or other monastic community, or on the side chapel, in a side chapel at a church. So I will continue to use the name house altar just to invoke that sense of scale, but they are also referred to as readables and general altarpieces as well. About 300 of them survive today, with about a quarter of those originating in the city of Brussels. And we'll talk a bit about Brussels and its importance in the larger production of house altars in a moment. But quickly, I assure you, a little bit of history. These house altars were produced during the heyday of the Burgundian Netherlands between about 1400 and 1550, which was a very dramatic period for this part of Europe. This is the site of major altarpiece production and other creative industries, such as tapestry making and jewelry making, silversmithing in particular. And this is because of a wealth of talent and an appetite for such luxury objects originating to the 12th century, when money was quite readily available due to the flourishing textile trade in these cities. The areas of Burgundy and Flanders had been united since the late 14th century through marriage, but it is really with Philip the Good, whom you see here on the screen, that the Duchy of Brabant comes into play. Philip the Good acquired it in 1430, And he really developed the strength in local trade and manufacturing that allowed for the growth of the guilds in the cities of Antwerp, Mechelen, and Brussels. It was also under Philip the Good that there was a bit of fracturing. As you can see on the screen, we have the area of Burgundy and the area of what we would call at that period Flanders. And there was a bit of distance between them. He was known for recognizing that there was a difference between, quote, the pays par de ça and the pays par de là, that is, the lands here and the lands over there, all of whom were ruled by a single ruler. When Philip the Good's son passed away without an heir, the entire Burgundian Netherlands passed into the possession of Mary of Burgundy, who in the same year married into the Habsburg house. So now we have the unity of the Burgundian Netherlands, that is the House of Valois, the Duchy of Flanders and Brabant, and now the Habsburg family. During her brief reign, Mary of Burgundy granted a lot of privileges to the guilds, and specifically to the guilds of Brussels, which gave them a lot of economic power and confidence towards the end of the 15th century. Mary subsequently died within 5 years of inheriting the Burgundian Netherlands, and her very young son, Philip the Fair, took control. Well, in fact, it was his Habsburg father, Maximilian, who took control as regent. And things became very complicated in the political situation. The currency had become devalued, prices were already in flux because of various wartime economic contributors, and he essentially lost the faith of the duchies of Flanders and of Brabant during this time, such that they revolted in the 1480s, destabilizing the political peace of the Burgundian Netherlands. And it was Philip the Fair's son, Charles V, the last member of the Burgundian dukes who had a great affinity for the Burgundian Netherlands, these areas. He was, in fact, born in Mechelen, had a great affinity for Antwerp and Brussels, and through the middle of the 16th century, he ruled them with grace and generosity. It was his son who would take things in a completely different direction, but thankfully that is beyond the scope of our conversation about house altars. Now, this brief history really did help to inform the profile of Brussels. It was the seat of the Burgundian ruler as of 1441 under Philip the Good, and it was therefore an administrative center, which meant there were nobles who worked for the court and who were rich enough to participate on the art market. They had grand houses within the city proper that they needed to furnish, and that led to a lively production of, as I mentioned, tapestry and jewelry, but also paintings and sculpture in this city. Philip the Good, in fact, started this tradition of patronage within the city of Brussels. He was an active patron of illuminated manuscripts, and particularly the Van Eyck brothers and Roger van der Weyden, two of the great, shall we say, tradition makers in the 15th century. And over the course of the 15th century, the guilds became extremely powerful in the city of Brussels. There were 49 guilds, and in the year 1421, they were actually given a spot on the city council in a way to counteract the importance and weight of the nobles that also sat on that council. All of this meant that Brussels was a highly desirable place for artists and artisans. Not only was there an active market, but the guilds worked avidly to argue for the strength and the privilege of the artists who were members of them. And we know that this altar was created in Brussels because of the mark here you see on the left. The Brussels Carvers Guild certified the quality of the sculpture in that central corpus, allowing it to be sold, presumably on the open market. For in fact, these altarpieces were the product of multiple types of artisans. Painters executed the wings. They were known as schilders. They were part of the Guild of St. Luke. Sculptors executed the carved figures of the central corpus, and they belonged to a guild for those who specialized in the carving of stone and wood. And then there were the joiners, the carpenters, who made the actual framework for the object itself. And these guilds worked for the most part together in the city of Brussels. They had a great deal of flexibility. But interestingly, it was only the painters who were allowed to sell a fully completed house altar. So they, in a way, called the shots when orchestrating between the various artisans. And I show you on the left the annual procession of guilds, of those 49 guilds and their members, on the Grand Place of Brussels, a way for these guilds to flex their power and political presence in the city. Now, I mentioned that the house altar was presumably sold on the open market. We don't, in fact, know how it was originally conveyed from the worker's hands to its first owner. It could have been sold through the painter at his workshop, as I mentioned, but it's quite possible that it was brought to the Pont, the great art market in Antwerp. While most cities were regulated to operate within their own city walls, Antwerp every year had a 6-week art fair at the end of the year, at which artists from beyond those cities' walls were able to sell their wares. It was located just outside of the Church of Our Lady, and it was one of the biggest art fairs in Europe. And in fact, it was the first building created specifically to act as an art showroom. It operated from about 1460 until about 1560, and it certainly would have been a major destination for serious collectors. There is a small coat of arms on the lower level of the altar, which would have had a painted insignia on it, but there is no evidence that it was ever completed. So this supports the idea that it was not commissioned, but was in fact sold on the open market. That said, we do have some documents alluding to commissioned altar pieces, such as the one executed by Jean de Mulder for the church at Antwerp. A document dated to about 1413, which is written in both Latin and Flemish. I find that very interesting. Documents that the shape, the dimensions, and the gilding will be according to standard procedure. But this commission is unusual in that the church at Antwerp wanted specifically to recognize the quality of craftsmanship that they desired in this altar. They stipulated that Jean de Mulder should make sure that his figures are well and masterfully cut with a good spirit and form, and that the wood that was used would be of good and dry quality. So they were very concerned about this being a top-notch altar. They also specified that the work was to be completed in 6 months and that they would pay no more than 16 Flemish pounds for this altar. Now, considering that the average tradesman made between, shall we say, 4 and 5 Flemish pounds a year, this indicates that these altars were a serious investment for an individual or a larger religious community. A separate document indicates that Jean de Mulder received 15 Flemish pounds, so he seemed to have fared pretty well. Such documents also specify the imagery, for the most part, that would appear in these altars. We see here imagery related to the transubstantiation, which is when Christ appears before the altar when Pope Gregory I is performing the Mass, literally taking the form of the host, which is the symbolic representation of Christ's body. When the imagery is not specified in a document, it could have been accompanied by a drawing. Very few of those drawings survive. One does not accompany the commission for this altarpiece. But it's interesting to think about the various ways in which desires and wants of patrons were communicated to artisans. As I mentioned, Brabant altarpieces are very much characterized by their mixed media design, but also by their narrativity. German altarpieces, for example, and I mentioned this earlier, were typically carved in both their corpus and in their wings, not necessarily polychromed at all. And Italian altarpieces of this period were typically non-narrative, and their wings did not move. They did not open and close. So Brabant altarpieces were very distinctive visually on the market. And as you can imagine, looking at the example on the screen, they would have had a very complex organization, but there was a standard approach to reading them, generally from left to right and bottom to top. So even when there was a more complex program, as we see here, with multiple compartments, the average 15th century viewer would have understood how to proceed and consume it. There was a standard repertoire of subjects for these altarpieces, typically scenes from the life of Christ, and particularly his passion, that is, his final days leading up to his death. But some communities preferred to have images of the life of the Virgin or specific saints that held particular value to them and their beliefs. Sometimes even it could be part of the larger Eucharistic tradition, as we just saw with the transubstantiation. The Phoebus Foundation readable has images from the Passion of Christ. From left to right, we have the carrying of the cross, that is, Christ walking with the heavy instrument of his martyrdom upon his back to the hill at Golgotha, where he will be killed. At the center, the carved corpus, we have the lamentation, that is, the grieving of his death by those close to him and others who were present at his death. And the right wing shows the resurrection, the miraculous rising from the dead of Christ after 3 days of interment. So we have here essential, fundamental ideas from the Christian tradition, focusing on death, afterlife, resurrection. It is further communicated and, shall we say, celebrated with details that really make for a stunning work of art. I had mentioned the gilding and the polychromy, but there are elements of brocade that adorn the undergarments of some of the figures, such as the figure that is presumably Longinus on the right, and some beautiful examples of punchwork that ornament the mantle of the Virgin. So really, this is an exquisite work of art on all levels. In Brussels in particular, artisans were focused on compositional simplicity and psychological realism. And we see that very much exemplified in this altar. You'll notice that in each scene, all action radiates out from the principal figure of Jesus, but in very different ways. With the scene on the left, the painted wing representing the carrying of the cross, we see the way in which Christ's body stoops under the heavy weight of the cross. He is being pulled by two soldiers, one who has a rope around his waist, the other, shall we say, brings up the rear, beats him periodically, and mocks him. We have this grimacing open mouth that faces us as he yells at the staggering Jesus. The Virgin and St. John the Baptist stand behind him, following him on this death march. And their faces convey anguish, concern, empathy. We have all of the fundamental emotions that relate to this incredibly harrowing moment in Jesus' life, conveyed by very much archetypal figures. My colleague, Jonathan Tavares, who is the curator of Arms and Armor here at the Art Institute, looked at this altar with me, and he related to me that this is very much contemporary armor that the soldier facing us is wearing. I wasn't exactly sure how to read it myself, so he walked me through it. There is a red undergarment over which a breastplate made out of steel is worn. And it is ornamented by perhaps red leather or some kind of textile. And then across the chest are two large loops to which various types of weapons would have been attached. And this is typical armor production from the Brabant region in the 1470s and 80s. In this scene, you also see one of the great pentimenti or changes that the painter made. You'll notice that the rope connecting the one soldier to the figure of Christ originally was painted a bit lower, but in the final image, it was raised by just a few millimeters, presumably to call more attention to this instrument of torture, if you will. In the carved corpus, we have the stiff body of Christ consumed by rigor mortis, lying on the lap of the Virgin, very much in the Italian tradition of the Pietà. It creates a bold diagonal line across the foreground of the scene, and it serves as a very, I think, compelling way to connect the three principal figures. While the body lies in the lap of the Virgin, on his right, Mary Magdalene, recognizable with her ointment jar, holds the shroud at Christ's feet, and the figure of St. John, while he expresses his anguish, cups the head of Christ. And the way in which the Virgin arranges the body is, I think, quite compelling. She, in a way, draws attention to the side of his chest where he would have been stabbed by the soldier Longinus while he was hanging from the cross. We can also see the numerous puncture wounds in his hands and his feet. And if you actually get very close to the altar, make sure not to set off the alarm, but you will notice on his right arm there is blood dripping up his forearm, suggesting that he has just been taken down from the cross and the blood is still flowing. It's a wonderful detail that gets me every time I see it. And the figure of the Magdalene, again, if you look very closely, has delicate tears that capture and reflect the light so beautifully, helping to articulate the immense sadness and loss that she is experiencing. St. John, as I mentioned, cradles his own head. His head is in his hands, expressing deep anguish and grief. This is a rather unusual gesture for him to make. Oftentimes, St. John is carrying the head of Christ, but the fact that he is burying his head in his hand, I think, offers a truly human response and evocation of grief that is not seen in other house altars of this time. And you'll notice that instead of the open landscape, the hill of Golgotha, this corpus and the figures in it are contained actually in a small chapel relating the original story that has engendered the Christian tradition to the actual architectural space where worshipers in the 15th century would have remembered it. On the right, the figure of Christ is emerging from the tomb after 3 days. I think he has a very, shall we say, physical but also elegant resurrection. He, in a very palpable way, is stepping out of that entombment. You have a sense of the physicality, or out of his tomb, you have a sense of the physicality of his body. He raises his right hand in gesture, a gesture of blessing, but he also very readily reveals his wounds on his hands and his feet. All of this is meant to evoke passion and compassion in the viewer. Also here we have contemporary weapons that would have been seen in the Brussels market for armor. The pole axe, the spears, etc., are all typical of this period. And just as interestingly, I think, regarding reflecting the world around the painter, he has looked to a background detail in an altarpiece created by Roger van der Weyden, who really dominated 15th century painting in this region. His Christ emerges from the tomb in a very confident and grounded way, similarly with his hand raised in a gesture of blessing. So it's probably no surprise that the Phoebus Foundation altar was attributed to Roger van der Weyden in the early 20th century. And even the diagonal line created by the very stiff body of Christ is one that can find its origin in the Miraflores altarpiece. We do not know who crafted the corpus, which is carved, or the painted wings, but it has been suggested that the painted wings were executed by an artist also active in Antwerp in the last quarter of the 15th century, who is known by the name of the Master of the View of Saint Gudula. And if you compare two examples of Christ before Pilate, you'll see that there are some similarities in the angularity of the body, the soft beard on the face of Christ, and particularly the golden halos with the red fluorescent, which were rather unusual in Brussels painting for this time. There are similarities also in the pose of the bodies of Christ in each of the resurrection scenes as well by this master. The one particularly in Paris seems to have a bit more of a kind of dance-like nonchalance, I would say, but all of the elongated bodies, broad faces, and the gold halos bear some resemblance to each other. And the Master of the View of Saint Gudula is a bit of an unknown artist. We believe that he ran a large workshop, so that could account for some of the differences that we see between the specific interpretations of this scene across his production. The emphasis on Jesus' death in particular, it comes out in the meditations on the life of Christ from the 13th century, where his humanity is brought out through highlighting his physical suffering. The lamentation is highlighted in the meditations, in fact, where it is described that the Virgin Mary supports the head and shoulders of the body in her lap, and that the Magdalene supports the feet, while others wail. It is also highlighted in the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, one of the great writers of the modern devotion, a movement during this period which espoused humility and simplicity and obedience. And there is an encouragement that the 15th century Citizen, take up the cross, therefore, and follow Jesus, and go forward into eternal life. And if you share in his eternal sufferings, you will also share in his eternal glory. So for the 15th century viewer, meditating on his suffering and his death in all of its minute details would inspire good deeds, unwavering devotion, and salvation. But we have not discussed the kneeling figures in the corners of the wings. They have been in the past considered to be donors. After all, this is where donors are typically located. In, for example, the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Hees, we have kneeling members of the Portinari family who are outside of the main action. They look upon it or out at the viewer in some instances. They are dressed in contemporary clothing. And there is a bit of a psychological remove for them from the scene that they are observing. However, Belgian conservator Sven van Dorst has done some technical analysis on this altar, and he has determined that these are likely not donors, or at least not the donors who commissioned or purchased this altar in the late 15th century. Using X-radiography, he was able to determine that the figure underneath, well, in fact, the figures underneath both kneeling women are painted in full. And if you look at the X-ray here, you can see that there is the lower half of the soldier's body underneath the kneeling woman. In typical 15th century practice, this figure, if she was to be a donor, would have been left in reserve. That is, an entire figure would not have been painted underneath her. After all, why execute something that would not be visible to your viewer? Similarly, we see a full figure, in fact, one that is now completely hidden from us, in the resurrection panel. We have another soldier underneath the kneeling woman. And you can particularly see those loops on his breastplate that we saw in the painted surface of the carrying of the cross. The exterior wings, which are not readily visible in the gallery, so kudos for coming today, you're getting a privileged view of things you can't see in the gallery, are likely also later additions or interventions. They represent two skulls with banderoles advocating the viewer to meditate on death. Again, Sven van Dorst, using macro X-ray fluorescence, was able to determine that underneath these painted skulls are the figures of two saints. Saints because they have gold halos behind them, and he has determined that they were likely Peter and Paul, particularly because the vermilion here seems to be part of a hilt to a sword being one of the great attributes of St. Paul. So why would these figures have been painted over? We are uncertain, but Sven van Dorst seems to think that it would have happened in the 16th century and likely contemporaneously with the addition of the two kneeling figures. Also in the Phoebus Foundation, there is a 16th century altar which has similar memento mori executed on its exterior wings. So could this have been done when the altar changed hands? Perhaps it went into the collection of a convent. Nicholas Gleesman has related the habit that these women wear to the habit that we see in a 17th century painting that represents the women of the Holy Trinity convent in Cologne. While we can't be sure that the altarpiece ever traveled to Cologne, it is interesting to think about it passing from a, shall we say, domestic context into that of a more communal one. And the fact that these could have been women who were enjoying this altarpiece raises the interesting question of the scenes that we see inside. The lamentation was often chosen by female patrons because it allowed for the presentation of so many women. Mary, the mother of Christ, Mary Cleophas and Salome, as well as other external figures. Now, this makes an interesting leap for us as we talk about the 20th century ownership of this object, because it was owned by a series of collectors who had a high quality, but also who were presumably, and for the most part, predominantly, women. It is first documented in 1921 in the hands of the Durlacher brothers in London. They had allegedly purchased it from a W.F. Lippmann, who was the son of the director of the print room in Berlin. So somebody who was clearly familiar with quality works of art. And just before World War I, or excuse me, just after World War I, the Durlacher brothers opened up a branch in New York City, which rapidly became the much more, shall we say, popular branch of the dealership, selling to the Cleveland Museum of Art and various East Coast collectors. And in October of 1921, Durlacher brothers sold this altarpiece to the Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art, with funds provided by Eliza Green Metcalf Radke, the daughters of RISD's founders, who really very much was the steward of the direction of the school once they had passed away. And so she brought it into the collection to allow it to inspire students who are focused on design, on craft. And it stayed in the collection of the Museum of Art at RISD for about 35 years or so, until it passed into the collection of Ruth Zickel Blumka. This is not Ruth you see on the C screen, but her son. I could not locate a portrait of her, unfortunately. But she is long known for being an astounding connoisseur of medieval art. And she bought the altar from the RISD School of Design's Museum of Art in 1956, and it stayed with her in her private collection. And when she passed away, it passed into the collection of her son, whom you see on the screen, Anthony, and into his inventory for his gallery. And he sold it in 2003 to the collector Hester Diamond, a staple on the scene of modern art in the 50s and 60s. Also, for members of the audience, the mother of Mike D of the Beastie Boys. Anybody? Yes, you're getting a little insight now. She had an astounding collection of modern art, but in the 80s, when her first husband passed away, she decided to sell that collection and start anew, focusing on Renaissance and Baroque art, painting and sculpture. But she juxtaposed it in really dynamic situations in her apartment. For example, a 16th century South German polychrome sculpture of Saint Sebastian, viola video piece. It makes for one of the most exciting viewing experiences possible. And she too was an expert connoisseur, so the fact that this altar passed from one of the foremost collectors of medieval art into one of the foremost collectors of Renaissance and Baroque art, I think really speaks highly of this object. And I managed to find an image of the altar in a hallway with other carved sculptures and reliefs. So this gives us a sense of how people in the 20th century lived with these types of objects. And it's a great reminder that context makes such a difference when thinking about art. It allows us to see our collection here at the Art Institute in dynamic new ways with the introduction of this long-term loan. For example, our Master of the Worcester Carrying of the Cross painting also shows the carrying of the cross, but in comparing it with the Phoebus Foundation altar, we see the emphasis on intense brutality and violence in our own painting. Kind of the swirling violence around the menaced Christ really comes to the fore. And it really highlights, I think, this terribly brilliant motif of Christ carrying his cross, but him really being flattened by it. In a way, his arms already outstretched as if he is on the cross before he gets there. We also have a representation of the Lamentation by the Brabant artist Herr David. In contrast to the 8-10 figures that surround Christ, we have just 3, the Virgin, Mary Magdalene, and St. John. And there is not quite the physical connection with the body of Christ. He is rather turned and put on display for us, highlighting his wounds, evoking suffering. In a way, this lays greater emphasis on the Eucharistic component of this painting. And then there is a slightly more focused work to compare with this, that of the Sorrowing Virgin from the workshop of Dirk Bouts. This image amplifies and extends the intense emotion that is conjured up in the Phoebus Foundation altar. Her red eyes, her numerous tears, really evoking for us in a clear and visible way the amount of suffering that she experienced and the suffering that we should experience when thinking about this narrative moment. However, one of the most thrilling aspects of having this loan in our gallery is that it is the sole intact altar in a gallery of disassembled altarpieces. Every single object in Gallery 202 would have been part of a larger ensemble, but we lose sense of that in the installation in that gallery. These are all individual masterworks, but having a full intact altarpiece to evoke how it would have been consumed and adored in its original environment helps us to understand that what we're missing when we look at these works of art in a museum context. So this altar, over the course of centuries, 5 centuries, I suppose, if I do my math right, has had many lives. It has served as a devotional aid, an inspiration for design and creativity, and also it has been part of a larger Gesamtkunstwerk, artfully arranged by a very daring collector. And it is a testament to the enduring appeal of this object across the centuries. So I'm thrilled that you will be able to enjoy it here at the Art Institute until 2027. And I invite you to go look at it now or in the next few days while you're here at the Art Institute. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have a question, we have some time here to discuss them. Thank you.